everyone. I appreciate your coming to this, our 38th meeting, our 38th course or class. This one is on the 9 modes of Baha'u'llah's revelation. That may sound like an unusual topic, but it's going to be a perfect preface to our deep dive into the revelation of Baha'u'llah for reasons I hope you'll understand by the time we get through with our meeting tonight. What I'm going to show you is entirely my own thoughts, and very little of it's authoritative, so you can take it for what it's worth. It's just a means I came up with when I was analyzing the writings of Baha'u'llah in the book, The Ocean of His Words, to understand the different categories of or modes that he is referring to in this passage, in which that phrase appears, which is in the Surah Haykal, the tablet of the temple, the surah of the temple. And he says that we have written our verses in 9 modes, and if we wanted to, we could have done many more. And of course, 9 is an important number in the Baha'i symbolism, because it doesn't mean simply the highest number before you have to start counting again. It also represents completeness. So, for example, we have 9 doors as a prerequisite for building Mashriq al-Azkar. So it symbolizes that every religion, every revealed religion, is a pathway to the same God. But that doesn't mean there have been only 9 religions. They're symbols of 9 religions on the temple in Wilmette, but there have obviously been a lot more than 9 religions, as we have discussed in our review of history over what's almost been a year now since we started. And so it's taken us a year to get to the revelation of Baha'u'llah in earnest, where we'll get into the works and into themes and so on. Obviously, we're not going to try to cover every work that he revealed or every work that's been translated into English or even authoritatively translated into English. Let me share my screen and show you the PowerPoint for tonight, which is titled, hold it, I didn't share, just 1 second. Let me go back and share screen and share, and there. All right. The 9 modes of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. The phrase comes from, as I said, the Surah Haykal, but before we look at that, I want to go back to a couple of passages we've looked at before, but that are very relevant to what we're going to discuss tonight. What is the purpose of Scripture? Well, on the one hand, you can say, well, that's obvious, to give you information. And yet, many religions feel that just the uttering of the Scripture is sufficient. So you have things like prayer wheels, or in some traditions where you pay people to say a prayer for you, or to that just the mere utterance itself is of value. Whereas I love this passage because it says it so straight, in such a straightforward manner. Baha'u'llah says, they have even failed to realize, they, that is the people of the various religions, particularly he's talking about those of Islam who repeat the utterances of the Quran without really understanding the deeper symbolic meanings they have, with such things as what is meant by the beginning and the end, what is meant by the Muhammad being the seal of the prophets and things like that. He says, they have even failed to realize all this time that in every age, the reading of the scriptures and holy books is for no other purpose except to enable the reader to apprehend their meaning and unravel their innermost mysteries. Otherwise, reading without understanding is of no abiding profit unto man. Now, the word abiding here is kind of crucial because, you know, you have that passage at the beginning of the prayer book that is cited that it's not a prayer, but it's a statement of Baha'u'llah that says that the saying of the prayers has an influence on the suppliant, even if he's not aware of it at the time, and even if he doesn't or she doesn't know exactly what it means, that there's a value to hearing the words, that they have an influence on your souls. But he says the abiding profit, meaning the enduring benefit of reading scripture, is to understand what it's trying to tell you. It seems obvious, but it's not so obvious, and it's a very important thing that, let me put it in another way. This is something I used to say in my graduate seminars, that is, if you simply learn what I have learned, then I'm not a good teacher. Your purpose is not to record information. My purpose as your teacher is to give you tools wherewith you can learn for yourself. And so the purpose of the scripture is to provide us with tools where we can understand what God is trying to tell us and abide accordingly by his guidance. And then I'm going to repeat this verse that I think it was last time, if you remember, in the proofs of the Kitab-i-Igan, the 5 proofs of a manifestation. And the very first one that goes on for about 20 pages or more is the revelation, the utterances, the verses revealed by the manifestation. And he says, therefore should a person arise and bring forth a myriad verses, discourses, epistles, and prayers, none of which have been acquired through learning. What conceivable excuse could justify those that reject them and deprive themselves of the potency of their grace? Now notice them is not the manifestation, it's not a capital T, so it doesn't mean he's not rejecting the manifestation, but rejecting the verses. What answer could they give when once their soul hath ascended and departed from its gloomy temple? And if it's not gloomy now, it will become gloomy, as we all find out as we get older. So I'm going to share this with you. We're not going to go over this in detail tonight, but I'm putting it on the PowerPoint so that when I turn the PowerPoint into a PDF file, for those of you who are downloading the PowerPoints, you'll have this list, though frankly, it's copied right from Wikipedia. You go to the works of Baha'u'llah, and this is what you get. And it's extremely valuable, particularly because their hot links are hyperlinks, as they're now called, to both the places. You'll see Tehran here, all those in blue are hyperlinks. And so you can see about the place and what relevance it had. So you've got the divisions of the works of Baha'u'llah in chronological order, each under the place in which it was revealed. So the first work revealed is a work that has just come out. I said just come out. It came out in the Call of the Divine Beloved, which was a collection, came out a couple of years ago. And it's a poem. Baha'u'llah wrote a number of poems, most of which have not been translated. This is the first one that has been authoritatively translated. Some of them, they're quite long. And this was revealed while he was in the Sea of Chal. Now, I didn't realize that myself until I was putting this together. Number one, that this was the very first thing he revealed as a manifestation, and that he revealed it while he was in chains and so forth in the Sea of Chal. And so then we come to, and I'm not, as I say, I'm not going to drag you through all of this. I just want you to see what's available. If you pull this up, if you Google the works of Baha'u'llah and go to Wikipedia, you'll have the same information, but you'll also have it on this PowerPoint. And so you have the works he revealed in Baghdad before he left to go to the mountains of Sulaymaniyeh. The interesting story about the revelation of the tablet of all food, that is his commentary on the tablet of all food. It's not a, excuse me, it's not a commentary on a tablet, it's a commentary on a verse from the Quran. And we'll discuss that later. And then you get into his return from Sulaymaniyeh and you get the mystic works. You get a poem he wrote while in Sulaymaniyeh, and this has not been authoritatively translated, called the Ode of the Dove. It's quite beautiful, quite well known. There's a couple of lines that the Guardian translated, but that's all. But there are many provisional translations of it that are pretty decent. And then when he gets back to Baghdad, we have some works that you may not know, such as the Book of the River. But then we have the ones you are familiar with, and that is the Four Valleys, the Hidden Words, and the Seven Valleys. And that's what we're going to start with next week, by the way, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The ones in yellow are the ones that are currently authoritatively translated. So you can see you've got these, the Book of Certitude, of course, also revealed in Baghdad, and then the Tablet of the Holy Mariner, which was revealed right before the message came that they would have to be exiled. The Tablet of the Hauda, which was revealed as they were going from Baghdad. I think it was around Mosul, but before they got to Samsun and took the boat to Constantinople. And then in Constantinople, you have only one tablet that was revealed, familiarly known as the Tablet of the Bell. And then Adrianople, you have all of the tablets that were revealed to, well, of course, the Tablet of Ahmad is one we're very familiar with, but then later in Adrianople, the tablets to the kings, the Suri Muluk, which is one tablet to all the kings. The Tablet of the Branch was important to the covenant, where he authorizes or designates Abdul Baha as his successor. The Loy Sultan, the tablet to Nasiruddin Shah. And so to the other kings and rulers, he begins, so he's announced himself in the Garden of Rizwan to his close followers. Now he announces his revelation to the world at large. So on the way to Akka, you have the Suri Rais, the tablet to Ali Pasha. And then after he gets to Akka, more tablets to more leaders and rulers. Again, the ones in yellow are the ones that we have translated. And of course, the tablet to Queen Victoria, to Alexander II, to Napoleon, and the Pope are included in the final version of the Suri Hakel. And so we have all of those. The Loy-e-Tib is, I don't know if that's been authoritatively translated, but it's been translated a lot. This is a tablet to a physician, and it has some guidance about medicinal theory. So here are some more in the, up to the, including the Kitab-i-Aglas, the most holy book that he reveals in Akka. And then after he is released from Akka, you have all of these tablets that are in that collection of what I call the Red Book, called Tablets of Baha'u'llah, revealed after the Kitab-i-Aglas. And these are the Tajaliyat, the Basharat, the Suri Bafa, and so on. All these are in that one collection. And they're reflections, many of them, on the laws. So you, again, the Ishraqat and the Taherzadeh, ornaments and so on. And then finally, towards the end of his life, the last 2 years of his life, Tablet to the Times is a or to the newspaper, the New York Times. I believe it's the New York Times. And then, of course, the Tablet of Carmel, which is included in the Gleanings, and then the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, which is a book unto itself. Now, these are just those that are presently authoritatively translated, and certainly not all of his works. Neither are all these all of his works. Now we're going to get to the heart of our discussion for tonight. First, we're going to start with we're going to deal with about the 3 propositions. One of them is, why did he use 2 languages? And this, again, is my understanding. It has no authority whatsoever, and you can take it for what it's worth. But as I considered the works that are utilized or that are written in Persian versus the works that are written in Arabic, I noticed a couple of things that seem to reflect what I call the principal creedal statement of the faith. And we've looked at this before, and that is these 2 obligations that each of us has, and that is to recognize God and to worship God, to know thee and to worship thee. Or, in other words, you need to gain knowledge, and then you put that knowledge into action, because worship, of course, in this context, doesn't just mean supplicating God in prayer. It means all the acts you do in your life that are for the purpose of either upholding and perpetrating and promulgating the cause of God, and simply carrying out spiritual principles in general. This same concept, as we've noticed before, is in the first paragraph, what I call the preamble to the Agdas. And that's the first duty prescribed by God is the recognition of the manifestation. And the second one is to obey his ordinances. The same concept, really. To know God, we have to know the manifestation. And so to know God and then to do what God tells us to do. And notice there's a third ingredient in this statement of the same creed. These twin duties are inseparable, neither is acceptable without the other. So they're not only related, they are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. You can recognize Baha'u'llah, but if you then don't obey his laws and follow his guidance, then can you really be said to have recognized Baha'u'llah? So it's a reciprocity, because the more you do one, the more enabled you are to do the other. The more you know Baha'u'llah, the more you will understand the value of his guidance and the spiritual meaning underlying these laws. And the more you do them, the more you understand Baha'u'llah. So it sort of spirals in this gyre we've talked about in many, many classes ago. So my theory is that there are 2 languages that serve these twin purposes. The book of Certitude, as you know, as we've said before, but we'll repeat it, is the most important doctrinal work of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, an essay about the concepts of progressive revelation and the station and proofs of the manifestation. So that's the new knowledge, if you will, not all of it, but it's the synthesis of it. And what's the idea of it being the most important doctrinal work is not my idea. That's according to Shoghi Effendi. The 2 most important works are the New Knowledge, the Book of Certitude, which is in Persian. And then in Arabic, you have the doing, the carrying out of that new knowledge, the Book of Laws, Ordinances, and Exhortation, the means by which the doctrine is implemented into personal and collective action. So why the distinction insofar as what characteristics does the Persian language have that the Arabic language does not have, and vice versa? He alludes to this in the Igan when he is about to talk about the verses, the first 100 pages, or just about 100 pages of the Igan. He is explicating some verses from the New Testament in order to show the Muslims that if they had understood the true prophetic meaning of the second coming, they would have been able to convert the Christians to Islam, because those prophecies are fulfilled with the advent of Muhammad, if you know the spiritual or symbolic meaning of those verses. And so he talks about Christ coming in a cloud, and what the cloud symbolizes, and so on, the trumpets and so on. They so he translates it twice, and one is in Persian and one is in Arabic. So and the reason is because, remember, most of his audience, of course, almost all of his audience are Muslims, and the central work of Islam is in Arabic, the Quran. But the translations of other works would be in Arabic. For example, the Bible, they would have probably had access to in Arabic mostly. So he says, in unfolding these mysteries, we have in our former tablets, which were addressed to a friend in the melodious language of Hijaz. Now, the melodious language of Hijaz is Arabic. And cited a few of the verses revealed unto the prophets of old. And now, responding to your request, we shall again cite in these pages the same verses, uttered this time in the wondrous accents of Iraq. Now, of course, Iraq you would think of as Arabic, but at the time it was part of Persia. And so they would distinguish between the Arabic Iraq and the Persian Iraq. So in that interesting, the adjectives he uses to describe the two languages, the melodious language of Hijaz and the wondrous accents of Iraq. He doesn't say that one is more beautiful or better than the other. But there is a distinction, and we'll notice it particularly when we get to the hidden words, and we'll notice the difference between the kind of language you have in the first part of the Arabic hidden words and the second part, which is the Persian hidden words. And we'll talk about that in a minute, just very briefly. One of the distinctions is the number of words, but this isn't as important as I used to think it was, I don't believe. And that is, Arabic has more words. Now, this isn't exact. This is just a guesstimation from dictionaries. So basically, Arabic has more words than Persian. And the language with the most words of any language in the world is English. And again, those aren't all the words by any means. But it gives you an idea of the fact that the richer a language is, the less you need to resort to imagery, to analogy, because you can say things with nuance, because you have so many words that are nuanced, shades of meaning. And so the fewer the words a language has, the more the writers in that language will tend to utilize poetic imagery. This doesn't mean that Persian poets are necessarily better than Arabic poets, but of course, Persia, for other reasons, cultural reasons, has a history of amazingly gifted poets, such as Rumi and Hafiz and so on. Now, I used to think of it in these terms, and again, my own thinking, not authoritative by any means. I think of it in terms of cuisine, and that is a country that is poor in the variety of resources it has insofar as comestibles or different kinds of food, the more it tends to use spices. So for example, you could say on the one hand, the number of different ingredients in, say, Mexican foods or in cooking and so on are not very many, and yet the incredible use of different sorts of spices. Most of them muy caliente. And the same thing I think is true, and to a certain extent, maybe a lesser extent, in Oriental cuisine, which is extremely rich with spices, as opposed to a place like, well, you have to say Britain is notoriously bad reputation for its cuisine, simply because for the most part it had access to lots of beef and so and so on. So you didn't need to dress it up much. You have a good steak, it's a good steak, and so on. Well, you get my point, and you can take the analogy for what it's worth. It may not be accurate, but it works for me. And of course, poetry is very spicy in that sense. So let's get to the central thesis of tonight's discussion, and that is, so in using language, whether in Arabic or in Persian, Baha'u'llah says in the Suri Hakel, let me get to this first. Say, we have revealed our verses in 9 different modes. Each one of them bespeaketh the sovereignty of God, the help in peril, the self-subsisting. A single one of them sufficeth for a proof unto all who are in the heavens on earth, yet the people for the most part persist in their heedlessness. Should it be our wish, we would reveal them in countless other modes. In other words, we could reveal them as many modes as we want. Now, does he mean literally only 9, or is this the symbolic 9? And that is a sufficiency of different styles and modes. And what does he mean by mode? This is something that interested me a great deal and caused me to write a book about it. The passage I skipped over is this one. And this is one we've read before, and it's from the Hidden Words. By my spirit and by my favor, by my mercy and by my beauty, all that I have revealed unto thee with the tongue of power, and have written for thee with the pen of might, hath been in accordance with thy capacity and understanding, not with my state and the melody of my voice. Meaning, in effect, I have, as the title of the slide says, he has accommodated our capacity. Because if he wrote as he might want to, or as richly and beautifully as he could, we wouldn't understand a word of it. And as a translator of the poetry of Taherzadeh, I can tell you that the very great deal of research into the allusions, which are just replete throughout her work, are necessary before you can understand a line of her poetry. So, in Taherzadeh's study, and I've recommended that several times simply because it's a 4-volume study of the revelation itself, and that's what we're studying right now. For the next long time, we're going to be studying the revelation, the revealed works. And so about the only relatively comprehensive study of the works are the 4 volumes of Taherzadeh. It's not intended to be particularly a scholarly work. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean, it's an easy read because he is, Taherzadeh is explaining for us what's in these works, since he's aware at the time he wrote them that they weren't available to us. So he does a beautiful job of sort of paraphrasing or writing a précis, if you will, of the major works. So it's extremely helpful, particularly regarding those works that have not yet been translated. So in that work, he deals with that statement that Baha'u'llah wrote in 9 different modes. And he says the following: a well-known Baha'i scholar, Janabi Fazl Mazindarani, after careful study of the writings, has enumerated these styles as follows. Now, here is what this well-known scholar decided were the 9 modes, the 9 styles. Notice he uses the word styles. The authoritative translation is now modes. Tablets with the tone of command and authority. Those with the tone of servitude, meekness, and supplication. Writings dealing with interpretations of the old scriptures, religious beliefs, and doctrines of the past. Writings in which laws and ordinances have been enjoined for this age and laws of the past abrogated. Mystical writings. Tablets concerning matters of government and world order and those addressed to the kings. Tablets dealing with subjects of learning and knowledge, divine philosophy, mysteries of creation, medicine, alchemy, and so forth. Tablets exhorting men to education, goodly character, and divine virtue. And finally, tablets dealing with social teaching. Now, without being too presumptive, I found when I looked over these before I started writing my own book, that these were not parallel categories. And by that, I mean, when you're going to divide something into categories, you want to use the same criteria. There's a lot of overlapping here. So you could have a tablet with the tone of command and authority that's mystical, or you could have a mystical writing that's dealing with social teachings. In other words, a lot of overlap here. They're not really there's not really one criterion by which he has divvied up the works of Baha'u'llah. But if you find that useful, you can. You certainly, as you read those, can relate to what works he's probably talking about. So he's talking about the mystical writings here. We presume, obviously, he's talking about the 7 valleys, the 4 valleys, and so on. When he's talking about dealing with laws, he's obviously talking about the alludes and so on. The Ocean of His Words is the name of the book that I wrote. And it's the whole book, or the main part of the book, looks at 9 categories that I came up with, which are really genres or modes in a literary sense. The 9 I came up with are the mystical treatise. So we're in sync on that one. And you have examples of the 7 valleys, the 4 valleys. The lyric mode. A lyric mode is a poem, a poetic mode, short lyric verses. Lyrics are usually relatively short. I include that, the Persian hidden words, the Arabic hidden words as 2 examples. I'm giving 2 examples for each of these. Doctrinal or philosophical essays, the Kitab-i-Igan, the Loy Hikmat, the Tablet of Wisdom. Gnomic verse. Now that phrase may not be familiar to you, but it comes from an ancient tradition of something like Proverbs is in the Old Testament. It's a list of axioms about proper behavior. And I find that term very applicable to things like the Splendors or the Glad Tidings, those works revealed after the revealing of the Kitab-i-Aqdas. So gnomic verse is, again, a list of do's and don'ts, if you want to put it simply. Epistolary works, and that is, of course, letters that he wrote. And you could divide those up into various forms too, because so much of his work is responding to letters and so on. But the letters themselves are distinct. The letters to the kings and rulers and the letters to believers. Allegory. And allegory is a term that we could discuss for a long time, but suffice it to say, an allegory is an analogy, an extended analogy, where usually where physical characters or things represent abstractions, but not always. So the allegorical works of Baha'u'llah, one of them very clearly is the Tablet of the Holy Mariner, where you have a mariner on these rough seas. And of course, the mariner is Baha'u'llah himself. The ark he is on is the Ark of the Covenant, and the rough seas and so on are the tribulations he underwent. The seven valleys is also an allegory. Now here you can see that crosses another, is also a mystical work. But it's a good example of allegory because each valley is a successive step of ascent. And we'll discuss that in depth next week when we discuss the seven valleys and how it works. But suffice it to say that these are seven stages of spiritual evolution of the human soul. Supplications and meditations. Now, of course, we have a whole book that unfortunately is rarely looked at, even though the Guardian went to great trouble to put them together. And that is Prayers and Meditations of Baha'u'llah, several hundred pages long and full of incredible prayers. Particularly interesting to me are the prayers where Baha'u'llah is praying to God about us. As I've said in some classes before, it's very much like a parent allowing a child to listen to the parent discussing us with a psychiatrist. Where I'm having trouble with the kids again. It's very interesting how he presents himself to God. On the one hand, he talks about his suffering, and yet he says, that is the greatest blessing that I can serve you. And of course, the prayer books themselves, which contain prayers, many of which are in prayers and meditations, but many of which are not. Homiletic and orational works. Now, homily is a sermon. And so these are works that have the feel or that come under the category of sermonesque writings. And there's several of them you'll be familiar with. One is the Tablet of Carmel, and the other is, and I don't know how you pronounce this, but maybe one of our Persian friends can tell me in the discussion afterwards. But Mubalek, I don't know. But it's the Proclaimer, and it's a portion of the tablet of the true believer in the Igan. And it's an incredible, no, excuse me, I'm sorry. It's in, I think it's in Epistle to the Son of the Bull. Any rate, it's the one where he says, have these things occurred? Oh, yes, they have occurred. You know, all of the signs of the resurrection have these signs. And it goes on one after another, listing all of the things that were predicted to occur with the second coming or the resurrection. And he confirms that, yes, this has occurred too. And then the legal documents of the covenant. And these, of course, we're very familiar with. The Agdas and the Taherzadeh is the book of my covenant. And of course, there's some others that fall into that category as well. So that's what I came up with. And you don't have to follow them or utilize them. But that's how, needless to say, with as much work as I put into writing the book, I want to use some of this as an approach to our study of the writings. And so we're going to begin with the mystical treatise as our first study into the works themselves. We're going to conclude tonight with something I found. There's a whole lot more to this. If you'll look at this same page on 172 in Gleanings and look at the whole discussion, it talks about the city of Babel, or Babel, however it is correctly pronounced. Of course, now it's a language teaching app, but of course it's in the Old Testament that as they built this Tower of Babel, they got so far from each other that the people at the top couldn't understand the people at the bottom because they spoke a different language. And of course, it's obviously symbolic, but it's interesting. At any rate, he discusses that in a passage that's part of this discussion. But I wanted to read this one because I think it's interesting in regard to what we're going to do. Mention hath been made in certain books of a deluge which caused all that existed on earth, historical records as well as other things, to be destroyed. Moreover, many cataclysms have occurred which have effaced the traces of many events. Furthermore, among existing historical records, differences are to be found, and each of the various peoples of the world hath its own account of the age of the earth and of its history. Some trace their history as far back as 8,000 years, other as far as 12,000 years. To anyone that hath read the book of Juk, and that's, I believe, in Sanskrit, but again, look up Juk, the book of Juk on Wikipedia, and it'll tell you all about it. It's very interesting, and it exists. It is clear and evident how much the accounts given by the various works have differed. Please God, thou wilt turn thy eyes towards the most great revelation and entirely disregard these conflicting tales and tradition. Now, I think it's important because if you have one account of, for example, of, well, I was just translating today, as a matter of fact, with my team, in a poem of Taherzadeh, which is telling the story of Solomon, which is retold in the Quran, and a story about Solomon that's not in the Old Testament. So you have a conflict there, which is the right. Same thing in the Old Testament, you have the two sons of Isaac and losing it here. Isaac, who was the other? I forget. At any rate, Isaac, Abraham is to sacrifice his firstborn son. Well, it's different in the Old Testament than it is in the Quran. And so, which is, well, as I've said early when we were discussing the Quran, we can believe that the Quran is more accurate because, as the Guardian says, it's the only other authoritative or untrammeled revealed text from any of the previous revelations. But what he's saying is, don't worry about these differences. In other words, rely on what I am telling you now, because it's not only the most recent revelation, but it's all you need to know, and you can rely on the authority and accuracy of it. I thought that was a very interesting comment. And so we end again with our lovely picture of the door to the Qibla, actually the door to the outer garden that is next to the Qibla.